everyone, it's time for story time from Josephine Ford's Playhouse here at Ford House. This week I'm reading a story from the Raggedy Ann stories. Now Raggedy Ann is a doll and she was very popular, and all of her stories were very popular in the 1920s. And that's when Henry II, Benson, Josephine, and William were all born and were living here on the estate after 1928. So this is a very popular story from that time, and that's why I've chosen to read it this week. This is a bunch of stories about Marcella and her favorite doll, Raggedy Ann. There's a lot of different stories about all of their adventures, but the one I'm going to read today is Raggedy Ann and the Kite. Raggedy Ann watched with interest the preparations. A number of sticks were being fastened together with strings covered with light cloth. Raggedy Ann heard some of the boys talk of the kite, so Raggedy Ann knew this must be a kite. When a tail had been fastened to the kite and a large ball of heavy twine tied to the front, one of the boys held the kite up in the air and another boy walked off unwinding the ball of twine. There was a nice breeze blowing, so the boy with the twine called, "Let her go!" and started to run. Marcella held Raggedy up so she could see the kite sail through the air. How nicely it climbed! But suddenly the kite acted strangely, and as all the children shouted advice to the boy with the ball of twine, the kite began darting this way and that, and finally making 4 or 5 loop-de-loops. It crashed to the ground. "It needs more tail on it," one boy shouted. Then the children asked each other where they might get more rags to fasten to the tail of the kite. "Let's tie Raggedy Ann to the tail," suggested Marcella. "I know she would enjoy a trip way up in the sky." The boys all shouted with delight at this new suggestion, so Raggedy Ann was tied to the tail of the kite. You can see this big picture. This time the kite rose straight up in the air and remained steady. The boy with the ball of twine unwound it until the kite and Raggedy Ann were way up and far away. How Raggedy Ann enjoyed being up there. She could see for miles and miles, and how tiny the children looked. Suddenly a great puff of wind came and carried Raggedy Ann streaming way out behind the kite. She could hear the wind singing on the twine as the strain increased. Suddenly Raggedy Ann felt something rip. It was the rag to which she was tied. At each puff of wind caught her, the rip widened. When Marcella watched Raggedy Ann rise high above the field, she wondered how Raggedy Ann enjoyed it and wished that she too might have gone along. But after the kite had been up in the air for 5 or 10 minutes, Marcella grew restless. Kites were rather tiresome. There was more fun and tea parties out under the apple tree. "Will you please pull the kite down now?" she asked the boy with the twine. "I want Raggedy Ann." "Let her ride up there. We'll bring her home when we're done with the kite. We'll get another ball of twine and let her go higher." Marcella did not like to leave Raggedy Ann with the boys, so she sat down upon the ground to wait until they pulled the kite. But while Marcella watched Raggedy Ann, a dot in the sky, she could not see the wind ripping the rag which Raggedy was tied. Suddenly the rag ripped apart and Raggedy Ann went sailing away as the wind caught in her skirts. Marcella jumped from the ground, too surprised to say anything. The kite released the weight from Raggedy Ann, began darting this way and that way, swooping to the ground. "We'll get her for you," some of the boys said when they saw Marcella's troubled face, and they started running in the direction Raggedy Ann had fallen. They ran and ran but couldn't find her. "She must have fallen almost in your yard," a boy said to Marcella, "for the kite was directly over here when the doll fell." Marcella was heartbroken. She went into the house and lay on the bed. Mama went out with the children and tried to find Raggedy Ann, but Raggedy Ann was nowhere to be seen. When Daddy came home in the evening, he tried to find Raggedy Ann, but was met with no success. Marcella had eaten hardly any dinner, nor could she be comforted by Mama or Daddy. The other dolls in the nursery lay forgotten and were not put in bed that night. for Marcella lay and sobbed and tossed about her bed. So you see she's concerned, and there's a picture of Raggedy Ann. "It's all my fault, Mama," Marcella said. "I should not have offered the boys dear old Raggedy Ann to tie on the tail of their kite, but I just want her back." Mama took her in her arms and soothed her with cheering words, although she felt indeed Raggedy Ann was truly lost and would never be found. Now, where do you suppose Raggedy Ann was during all of this? Raggedy Ann had dropped from the kite when the wind caught her skirts and carried her along until she fell into the fork of a large elm tree directly over Marcella's house. When Raggedy Ann fell with a thud face up in the fork of a tree, 2 robins, who had nests nearby, flew chattering away. Presently, the robins returned and quarreled at Raggedy Ann for laying so close to their nest, but Raggedy Ann only smiled at them and did not move. When the robins quieted down and quit their quarreling, one of them hopped closer to Raggedy Ann in order to investigate. It was Mama Robin. She called to Daddy Robin and said for him to come over. "See the nice yarn? You could use some of this to line the nest with." So the robins hopped closer to Raggedy Ann and asked if they might have some of her yarn hair to line their nest. Raggedy Ann smiled at them, so the 2 robins pulled and tugged at Raggedy Ann's yarn hair until they had enough to line their nest nice and soft. Evening came and the robins sang their goodnight songs, and Raggedy Ann watched the stars come out and twinkle all night and disappear into the morning light. In the morning, the robins again pulled yarn from Raggedy Ann's head and loosened her so she could peep over the limb. And when the sun came up, Raggedy Ann saw she was in a tree in her own yard. Now, before she could eat any breakfast, Marcella started out to find Raggedy Ann. And it was Marcella herself who found her. And this is how she did it. Mama Robin had seen Raggedy Ann with Marcella out in the yard many times. And she began calling, "Cheery, cheery!" And Daddy Robin started calling, "Cheery, cheery!" Marcella looked up into the tree and above the house to see the robins had discovered Raggedy Ann peeping over the limb. Oh, how her heart beat with happiness. "Here is Raggedy Ann," she shouted. And Mom and Daddy came out and saw Raggedy Ann smiling down on them. Daddy got the clothes prop and climbed out of the attic window and poked Raggedy Ann out of the tree until she fell right into Marcella's arms, where she was hugged in a tight embrace. "You'll never go on a kite again, Raggedy Ann," said Marcella, "for I felt so lost without you. I will never let you leave me again." So Raggedy Ann went into the house and had breakfast with her little mistress, and Mama and Daddy smiled at each other when they peeped through the door of the breakfast room, for Raggedy Ann's smile was wide and very yellow. Marcella, her heart full of happiness, was feeding Raggedy Ann part of her egg. So that is one of the stories in this book. You can check this book out maybe at your local library or a bookstore and read some of the other stories that were popular in the 1920s. Be sure to check our video about the art project that was inspired by this story. And I'll see you all next week for a new story and a new art project. Bye!